The central issue in this book really has to do with how did you get to a modern, relatively clean, uncorrupt, effective state? What was the magic sauce by which this happened in places like Denmark or Germany or Japan or Britain, and what lessons does that hold for contemporary developing countries? The main inspiration for this book was Samuel Huntington's classic work, Political Order and Changing Societies. Samuel Huntington was a Harvard political scientist. He wrote this book back in 1968, and the basic message of that book was all good things do not go together, because previously the theory and development had been that all good things did go together. If you had economic growth, the growth of individual freedom, social mobilization, economic change, that all of this would be mutually self-supportive and it would support modern democracy. And Huntington looked around the world at the time in the 1960s and said, well, that doesn't seem to be happening, that in fact economic growth spurs social mobilization, demands for participation, countries don't meet it, and then you get coups, civil wars, and a lot of political instability. There are certain trade-offs that you have to make between, for example, good governance on the one hand, and democracy and popular participation on the other, because good governance requires merit, expertise, technical knowledge, authority, and the like. And I think that democracy demands popular participation. It means democratic control over state institutions. And as in the case of a phenomenon like clientelism, where politicians use the democratic process to further their own self-interests, there's a real problem for the quality of government. And so democracies really have to learn how to deal with that problem. Political decay, in my definition of it, stems from one of two sources. First, it's institutional and cognitive rigidity. We create institutions. We human beings love to create rules that govern our lives, but we're also an extremely conservative species. And once we create those rules, they're based on a certain mental model of how the world works. And if it turns out that based on empirical experience, the world isn't working that way, we're oftentimes very hesitant to change the model. The other one that I think is particularly relevant in contemporary America has to do with what political scientists call the elite capture of institutions. Modern institutions are supposed to be impersonal. They're supposed to treat people as citizens, not differently from one another based on whether you're a pal of the president or a member of Congress or something of that sort. And I think one phenomenon that occurs in virtually all political regimes is that the rich and the powerful, particularly, and sometimes it's not only the rich and the powerful, but primarily those, use their access to the political system to politically protect their interests by reducing competition, by creating barriers to entry for other political players, by voting themselves subsidies or protecting their jobs or things of this sort. And that's another factor in political decay, is this capture of state institutions by elites over time. And I think, like many Americans, I'm worried that we're seeing some version of this. We certainly see a number of rigidities in the way we think that institutions need to work, but more worrisome, I think, is just the influence of lobbyists, interest groups, very powerful organized interests that, of course, are legitimate in a democracy, but in, I think, the contemporary United States exert influence way beyond what they actually represent in the population. And so I think, for that reason, I would say that the United States has been experiencing political decay, and its political institutions are not functioning as well as they could. This doesn't mean that American civilization is in decline, because America has never, primarily been about its government. It's been more about the private sector and business and entrepreneurship, and that's booming, and that's, it's been sickly, but it's recovering nicely. But I think American government is in a fair amount of trouble. We can't pass budgets. We can't agree on, really fairly simple, commonsensical kinds of policies, and That's not a good sign. I'm a member of one of the Freeman Spogli Institute's constitutive centers, the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And I think that one thing that I and my colleagues have worried a lot about in the past few years is the fact that for many countries the appeal of democracy is very much rooted in just their vision of America, and the fact that America is rich and powerful and prosperous and seems to be doing well. And quite frankly, I think with the amount of political polarization and dysfunction in Washington, that's just not true any longer. Partly it also has to do with foreign policy, the various wars we've engaged in over the past decade. But it also has to do with our own political process. I think that it's hard to say that anyone would turn to Washington and say, yes, you as a young democracy ought to shut down the government because you can't agree on paying your past debts. That's not a model of good behavior for anybody. And therefore, I think American influence in international affairs has diminished as a result of this. And so I think until we get our house in order, that projection of our values and institutions is going to be very much more difficult.